guys are absolutely fantastic ambassadors for the community, not just in their rigorous research, but also in their comedic personalities. So I'm sure we're in store for a very, very entertaining talk at the same time with the Irish charm of Ivor Cummins. And the American grit of Dr. Jeffry Gerber as well. So please
Good. Well, I'm actually reminded of a quip from Blackadder, which was last and by all means least. So we'll see. So this talk is kind of around heart disease, and some people may have seen similar material before. Myself and Jeff have done a couple of double acts. And I'll cover kind of some of the sciencey side, not too heavy, and Jeff then will cover a clinical perspective. So I won't bother with the content, I'll go straight on in. So I was going to treat you to some of my favorite hypotheses and research from a few months ago on insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia pathways, and I think it's fascinating. But Sam said that this would likely happen. So I'm going to spare you that, and because I'm Irish, I'm going to kind of tell you a bit of an old story instead. And the story is actually my story, but there's a little bit of interesting data in there also. So here was me in 2013, happy as Larry, going into the doctor for some routine blood test results. It's not a great likeness, I never wear a tie, but it's close enough. And I was hoping to get just normal results, which I traditionally did get many years before since my last test. But here we have gamma-glutamyl transferase, which is a liver enzyme and has linkages to inflammatory issues, and serum ferritin, the iron loading in the blood, and then our old friend cholesterol. Okay, so that's the way they should look. But this is the way mine looked. So a little bit of a pensive view there. And as I chatted to the doctor about it, in the back of my mind, my history actually is as an expert problem solver leading complex problem solving with engineering teams. So I've quite a lot of background in data and physics and biochemistry. So as I was talking to the doctor, I'm looking at these and I'm realizing, hold on a minute, I've kind of hit a jackpot here, because it's not just on the upper end of the distribution of the population, because I see the lab reference ranges on the printout, and I realize I'm wacko out. And another thing I quickly realize while I'm chatting, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, is that for something like this, there's going to be a couple of primary root causes. 1, 2, or 3 primary causes. Not going to be 50, it's not the way it works, even in a complex system like a human. So they're going to be findable, and I decided I'm going to have to find those pretty quickly. So I discussed with the doctor and I asked quite a lot of questions, maybe more than the average patient. And what I could get was possibly hemochromatosis, which I wasn't really familiar with at the time, but they call it the Celtic disease. A few % of Irish people hyperabsorb iron from the gut. Survival trait thousands of years ago, but now it kills you because we got a lot of iron in our environment. Reduce the wine intake perhaps for the GGT, because most doctors associate elevated GGT with alcohol. And indeed there is a connection, but often they don't know the other associations. And more healthy whole grains, kind of food pyramid riff, the usual old rubbish. So I said, okay. So I went to another doctor, a family friend, a bit more experienced. And again, I got hemochromatosis possibly, as fine. Got the test a couple of weeks before I get the results. The wine intake, GGT, okay, heard that before. But I knew, although I enjoyed a couple of glasses of wine an evening, I knew with my body mass and my general health, it didn't make sense that I'd be this far out for a couple of glasses of wine. That made no intuitive sense. And reduce the fat came up with this doc. And the last one I went to was a very experienced guy. Same thing essentially. The last person did note that for the last 25 or 30 years, he's noticed more and more middle-aged men coming in with elevated ferritin, and it's trended up over 30 years. And he's been sending out for loads of hemochromatosis tests, and most of them are negative. So he was curious, what is that? He was interested. And a couple of weeks later, I told him. But so anyway, there was the wine and the fat, you know, the usual stuff. So people in my work world know when the expert team doesn't have their data together, doesn't know their stuff, sometimes I can react a little bit like that. But not in front of the professionals, this was in my own time. But I was quite annoyed because I have 5 children, I'm fairly health conscious, and I know that figures like these look very ominous, and I wasn't getting any clarity on what to do. So I had logons to ResearchGate and to PubMed through my organization, and I said, okay, I'm going to have to go back to the data, just like I do in my day job. And you can see here there's 10,000 publications plus for serum ferritin, so there's plenty of data there. And there's around 42 million for cholesterol, and most of those are rubbish too. But anyway, I had plenty to go after. So in the first couple of weeks of evenings, I began to get some data. Cholesterol I got out of the way quite quickly because I began to get reports like this, the Hunt study with many thousands of people tracked over 15 years. And for men in the blue curve and for women in the red, even more markedly, higher cholesterol without exception was lower mortality, right? So a happy face there, right? And even up over 7 millimole of total cholesterol. And also for cardiac death and cardiovascular death, there was the same relationship. I'm just showing all cause because that's the important one, right? So I also found from Framingham pretty quickly that here you can see anyone with a HDL that's pretty high. The LDL can be anything from low right up to really high, 5.7 plus. And there's no real elevation of risk for middle-aged men. And last I checked, that's what I was, right? So the LDL didn't mean anything to me because my HDL was reasonably high. So I saw quite quickly the whole cholesterol thing seems to have become convoluted, so I better move on. So I moved on to GGT, the really high one. And I'll just remind people though, I'm sure you all know, in associational studies for any risk factor, you want a 2x odds ratio or multiplier of risk for it to be meaningful. I mean, anything that's a 1.2x risk, like the WHO with meat causing cancer, is just irrelevant, right? Because just the noise. Any engineer knows that. So anything above 2 is interesting, and I found some interesting things. So for heart failure here, being simply above the median was a 3x risk for heart failure, okay? Here for coronary artery disease, right, the big one, a 7x risk to be in the highest quartile. And many of these studies were correcting for other factors, right? Even some of them correcting for alcohol and cigarette smoking, getting it down from 7 maybe to 4, still huge multipliers. The Minnesota Heart Study around 2000, the 11% who were over 50 in GGT had 9 times the risk for AMI. This one really got me. Type 2 diabetes, biggest disease in the world. Retinopathy, you know, neuropathy, heart disease, most heart diseases that. And for my weight range there, where the arrow is shown, being in the top quartile was a 15x risk for future diabetes. And again, this was corrected for age, race, ethnicity, alcohol, cigarette smoking, all the rest. These are impressive multipliers. So I was angry. And especially seeing as I didn't get any of this from really any of the docs with any clarity. So ferritin then I moved on to, and unfortunately ferritin wasn't much different. Here we can see a 5x multiplier for the top quintile, which I was well above. And you'll notice that when they adjusted for other risk factors, it didn't even change the line. And there's a bit of an exponential kick there at the end. That's a pretty solid risk factor, right? And later I learned the mechanisms and as to why it was. It reflects inflammation, and iron partakes in many processes. This one is interesting. You'll notice here that low LDL people versus super high, over 5 millimole of LDL, not total, LDL. No difference in AMI or in myocardial infarction in this study until you actually look at the people's ferritin. And then you see that the ferritin actually dominates, and also it's interlinking and synergistic with high LDL, which also makes mechanistic sense. I found out a couple of weeks later. But ferritin's a big deal. I'll finish with carotid atherosclerosis. Men here, 10 times the risk for high ferritin, over 50, right, with some correction done for confounding. And they had premenopausal women in this study too. Low ferritin women were lower than the men, the low ferritin men, because women have less issues, premenopause. But the high ferritin women were pretty much up the same size risk bar. It's kind of interesting too. So I'm pretty annoyed now because I know what these ORs mean. These mean something's got to be done. So I went to Singapore on a business trip. Here I am in Jumbo Seafood. I'm pretty annoyed. And I had crabs back here as well at this time. Chili crab, pepper crab, a delicacy, really delicious, I recommend it. But no, I was there, and you can see a lot of subcutaneous fat, you know, you kind of got the fatty football head. And, sorry? Oh, I still have a football head. Oh. So anyway, I'm there, and I'm really annoyed. So I do another month back home, and I do a lot of intensive research, and now I'm going into the heavy biochemistry and all the mechanisms. But I discovered a metabolic or insulin resistance syndrome, and I couldn't believe I never heard of that before. I mean, it makes cholesterol look like a joke, and never heard of it. Cholesterol, with more study, was almost meaningless to an engineer, unless you're in the stratosphere and unless you're interacting with other inflammatory problems. And low-fat diets made no sense whatsoever, because the biggest disease process in the world would be made worse with a high-carb diet. So I realized there's been some funny stuff going on a long time. And then I had a eureka moment. Because in engineering, when you've got a hypothesis, you create a hypothesis based on triangulating all of the data and mechanisms, and you test yourself by hypothesizing something must be true, and then you check it. And what I hypothesized was GGT and ferritin must be serious markers for this metabolic or insulin resistance syndrome. They had to be if all my triangulation was correct. And they were. So I hadn't linked them before, but when I went searching, you can see ferritin there, dramatic links, even exponential with number of MS criteria, and that's a Stephanie Seneff paper on the right, but you can see some of the words, right? So I pretty much had it now, and I also had the solution in my mind. And the text, I don't even know what that said. It's a computer interface thing. Anyway, what it said was, I only did a nutritional intervention, only. So no exercise and no funny stuff, just nutritional. And this was I'm not saying exercise is funny, I mean, I wanted it to be nutritional only because I believed it was the biochemistry of what I was putting in my mouth was doing it. So I wanted to do nutrition only. Here I was eating a reasonable diet. I was a little heavy on the milk chocolate. I drank a lot of juice. So, okay. I ate a lot of healthy whole grains because I did actually believe that stuff. And I thought they were dry and healthy and they wouldn't clog anything, right? So I ate a lot of those. A couple of glasses of wine a day usually, and I did eat good dinners. In our house we have traditional Irish meat, veg and potatoes every day for dinner, so I was eating pretty okay there. Occasionally pizzas and not so good stuff, right? So I switched based on the science to what will be very familiar to you guys, right? A classic low carb, high healthy fat diet, cut out the sweets and the juices, ate dark chocolate, classic stuff. Okay. You'll note the wine I kept constant because I was not going to confound my experiment. No way. Yeah. And also, well, I wanted to keep drinking the wine, but I did not want to confound though genuinely because that had been put forward, and from my research I didn't believe that was really meaningful in my GGT, so I didn't want it confounding. The cliche, okay, that's what I did. Fair enough. And a little tailored, I cut some of that fruit out, so it's more like you see there. But basically an inversion. And I held to it. And I discovered that within a week or two, my appetite control became exquisite. And I began to skip meals. So I did kind of do fasting as part of this too, but only because it was enabled so easily. So it's still linked to the nutrition. So you got this guy here, obviously a fat guy, all these problems. What happened when I applied the solutions? Well, we got a GGT and ferritin here through the roof. 8 weeks, they're pretty much back down to range, come lower since. That's pretty fast. At the risk of sounding arrogant, I kind of expected that, but anyway. But the cholesterol metrics, right, which were not too bad actually, because I showed up most in those liver metrics, but my cholesterol wasn't too bad, but they all improved greatly. Which makes sense, because when you get a true root cause, all boats rise. Sometimes things get better in your process or in your product that you weren't even expecting, because you fixed an underlying fundamental problem, right? The blood pressure was always high unless I was doing triathlons. Anytime I wasn't training, it would drift up to pre-hypertensive. That came down nicely, along with the weight around 15 kilos. and the waist, etc. Interestingly, importantly, because a lot of idiopathic hypertension is actually hyperinsulinemia linked, my blood pressure came down way before the weight came off, right? So it's the biochemistry that changed. It wasn't the weight causing the blood pressure, although it might have a bit of a contribution. So root cause solution approved, and n equals 1, but again, it was predicted and it came true, and dot the I's. So why could I go and do that? Okay, I have a lot of experience in problem solving, but it doesn't make sense that I have to go and do that when I'm not an expert and when the experts are not sure. These are standard blood tests. These are not wacky, unusual ones. And one of the reasons is legacy, that there's certain turkeys who set really bad science in motion. And it's not really just his fault, because he believed it. But the train that left the station, no one could stop. All the academics, all the researchers, industry jumped into, but it wasn't just them. Everyone got stuck with a theory that after 10 or 15 years, when it was obvious it was looking really rough, they couldn't leave it behind. And this population disaster we have is largely due to that. So we'll move beyond the cholesterol stuff really to primary drivers, real drivers of cardiac disease, important ones. And I did do a lecture on, it's on YouTube if anyone's interested. I go through all the mechanisms, the VLDL down to IDL, LDL, and all the kind of physics of how that works, and also HDL, very important functionality. But I won't make you suffer it here, but any masochists can get it on the YouTube. So I will though bring up one expert in cholesterol, a top lipidologist in the States, very acknowledged and recognized in the low carb community. And he clarified a few years ago a couple of things for me. He said most heart attacks, Ivor, yes, are due to insulin resistance. And he said LDL is a near worthless predictor for cardiovascular disease, unless it's over 200 or 5 millimole. I even wonder about that caveat. Because William P. Castelli, and I have the paper from '92, published and peer-reviewed, made this statement in a paper, and he was the director of Framingham, a cardiologist and a stats guy. And he said unless it's over 7.8 millimole, you can't really trust it without looking at other metrics. And I'm suspecting not a lot of people know that this is the case. There was a lot of Framingham data in for him to make that judgment. It wasn't based on a small data set. And now, a few months ago, we see the burden of coronary vascular disease is growing faster, outpacing their ability to deal with it. After 30 years or 40 years of science, a lot of it hinging on cholesterol, well, this is what happens when you don't move from poor theories to proper ones. And in engineering, we say, if you don't measure it, it don't get fixed. And here, if you don't measure the right thing, it don't get fixed. So many teams over the years have gone down a hole by just focusing on the wrong metrics. Okay, so I will show a brief study. I won't bore you with studies, but this one from Reven is a nice indicative one on insulin resistance and its potential linkages to cardiovascular and other disease. So it was Reven, the kind of father of the metabolic syndrome. And they got a few hundred 65-plus-year-old people, split them randomly, but they used a steady-state plasma glucose test, a bit like an insulin clamp test. It's very accurate, because the fasting insulin is very noisy. That's why a lot of studies are noisy. And it's a Kraft type test, which Jeffry actually will go through Kraft's work shortly. And what happened after 3 years? Well, the low insulin people in this accurate test of sensitivity, there were no incidents of disease, death, nothing, which is unusual for people 65 plus over 7 years. Middle tertile was a little different, right? They had a bit of action going on, not too surprisingly. And the upper tertile had a lot, right? And you can see the nice linear, and the statistics, it's not huge numbers of people, but it was randomized, and the statistics are P0001. This is real. It's associational, but it lines up with all the mechanistic science and with everything else. And what did these people, what were the diseases? Were they all cardiovascular? No, they were kind of all the modern inflammatory chronic diseases of civilization, right? There was also a few cases of very high hypertension, right? And Reven himself quoted from this paper, he said, look guys, insulin resistance is so important in the etiology of most chronic diseases. Someone's going to have to take this work and do some proper work on it. No one has, really, because it's not cholesterol. well, that's not the only reason, but. So anyway, that gives an idea. So the way I view it, and Jeff views it now, is we're all on a hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance spectrum. I don't really like people being called diabetic or pre-diabetic, because to an engineer, it's something, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. You've either got diabetic physiology or you don't, and probably 2/3 of adult Americans now have diabetic physiology. So to me, they're all diabetic. It's just varying extents. But anyway, there's the spectrum. On the left, down the bottom, you have truly non-diabetic, and we estimate maybe 1/3 of adult Americans are truly non-diabetic. Their insulin and leptin signaling is perfect. A Kraft test will pass. You know, they don't have problems with lipolysis. They don't have hypertrophic fat cells. Everything's good. And then up on the right, you basically have wheels off the wagon, full-blown diabetes, right? You know, everything's got hypertrophic fat cells, glucose transport in the fat cells, the de novo lipogenesis that crosstalks to the liver, all of the mechanisms of diabetes and its etiology have gone to hell, right? And that's just the way it is. And broadly speaking, there are other drivers for specific diseases, but broadly for the population. Down on the left, you're going to have healthy hearts, like these indigenous people had, with their insulin on the floor and their glucose on the floor. Good health, longevity, vitality, productivity. And up on the right, that's where you'll have most of your heart attacks, you know, and your peripheral vascular disease and your Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes and cancers. Broadly speaking, that's kind of the way it lays out. And just to make an important point, it's not obesity really, because you can have very heavy people, up to 40 or 45 BMI, down here and insulin sensitive. And insulin sensitive obese are fascinating to look at the actual mechanisms of this. And they are actually pretty much metabolically healthy. In the middle there, tertile or so, you have pre-diabetic, hyperinsulinemic, unhealthy, right? And there you can be slim apparently or fat. It's not really the weight, it's the state of your fat cells, your adipocytes. And up on the right, we have the classic very overweight person who's close to a heart attack, right? Highly insulin resistant, packing a huge amount of pounds, and they're the cliche. But you've also got relatively slim people up there. I'll show you one in a moment, okay? Here's where I was, roughly. I found out all about this from GGT and ferritin. That was my flag, right? I got a calcium scan later, which is the ultimate test, but I got that later. But my supporter, who's helping myself and Dr. Gerber with a book and other things, he's an entrepreneur from Ireland, David Bobbitt, he found out because he was 52, running 4 times a week, slim as a whippet, and he was the top 5 or 10% of his age group for the stress test on the treadmill, right? Executive stress test. This guy is obviously very, very wealthy, getting the top tests. All clean. HbA1c, no problem, 5.3. But he got a calcium scan, and he's got multiple major blockages. He's a score of 960, right? And unfortunately, someone who does a lot of fitness work but has diabetes, they can often hide their classic risk factors. So his HB was fine. Now, a few weeks later, he finds out his postprandial glucose going up to 25 after a meal, right? And of course, his insulin, he's a raging type 2 diabetic, and that's what destroyed his heart. But he was really slim and super fit. Big shock. And that has motivated him to fund getting this message out across the world. And especially the calcium scan, which is the ultimate test, and Jeff will talk to that. So what about you or your patients? You guys know a lot of this stuff anyway, but a lot of doctors may not. And I guess that's the big thing. How do you convert all the doctors in the world? How do you know? Well, the CAC is kind of the last word. It's an engineering test. It will tell you how much of this problem you've had in your life to date with eerie precision. And it will predict mortality and cardiovascular events with eerie precision because it sees the disease. But if you don't have a scan, you've also got some really good metrics that are really good metrics. And if you triangulate and get all these metrics and you get them all in the low range, you're very likely down in a very safe space, right? And there's other people have their favorites. I've just put a few here. So I'll try and speed it along. Just for Jerry Davies, I will mention before we get on to how you fix this problem, the microbiome. There's some interesting recent work that the microbiome, if it's problematic and you've leaky gut, lipopolysaccharide gets into your system, does immune reactions, and it actually drives up hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. So even the microbiome can drive the deleterious pathways we're talking about. But can you really just switch off your microbiome and switch it to a good place? Is that a lever you can use? Well, Jerry, I know you probably say you can, but in general, what you're going to do is not directly touch that. You're going to change what you put in your mouth. So we have a kind of bunch of levers you can apply. These are no-brainer elimination levers, right? Refined carb, sugar, processed food, other than sausage or cheese, good processed food, people probably know what I mean, and vegetable oils have no place in a human body, right? That's just an eliminate. Then you've got low carb, healthy fat, and high quality protein. We favor animal sources. Low carb, but vegetable carb and fibrous carb that gets down to your ileum and triggers GLP-1 and PYY and has benefits, okay, but it's above ground vegetables, not starchy carbohydrates. When you do that properly, your appetite, like mine, became much easier to control, and you can enjoy fasting and skipping meals, which is tremendously liberating, makes you feel good. I actually haven't eaten since yesterday evening, and often when I'm giving a talk, I purposefully don't eat for that whole day because I feel much better. I feel sharper. There's a few more levers. Sun and sleep and stress management are very important, and they will have been talked about before. And for some people are really important, some people can get away with murder. Exercise, stress exercise actually, and resistance training, a few 15 minutes a week in your living room. There's some great routines that can be done with push-ups, squats, a few other things, no equipment. Huge benefits. And supplements, particularly on a high-fat diet, potassium, magnesium, and maybe omega-3 and some other things. But that will vary on the person. And if you did all those things, and if we could tell the public, hey, this is how it works, here's kind of the 10 things you do, and they're not too complicated, and if the public believed it because our authorities understood this stuff, right, and you rolled it out, you could move the public down from the disaster zone they're in down to ancestral health. And you've got the measures where you can kind of validate you've achieved it. Otherwise, the population keeps going up into essentially metabolic mayhem, which is what Jeff is now going to talk about. Thank you. Okay.
So thank you, Ivor. That was the engineering perspective, and now I'd like to share with you the clinical perspective. And I'd like to thank Sam for the invite, and it's been a pleasure to meet you through the past few days, but especially I've connected with all the NHS GPs, because you see, I'm a family doctor in the United States, and across the pond, as you say, we're doing the same thing, and it's a global effort. So cheers to us. So back to insulin and cardiovascular disease. And that brings us to Dr. Joseph Kraft. So Dr. Kraft was a pathologist, and he spent a career studying insulin metabolism. And he noted that there was a strong connection between diabetes and heart disease. Now, Dr. Kraft was well published in the literature, but it wasn't until he retired that he wrote this book, The Diabetes Epidemic in You. And this book really details the 5-hour insulin assay, and we'll talk about that. So Dr. Kraft set out to create a gold standard based on measuring insulin, because no one had done this previously. And the way the test was performed was to administer a glucose challenge and to not only measure glucose, but also insulin over a 5-hour period of time and at intervals in between. And he had done this test throughout his career in over 14,000 subjects. And when he looked at the data, he saw that it clustered into several different patterns. So there was this pattern 1 that he called normal, and then it was the 3 patterns of hyperinsulinemia that he identified and also called it diabetes in situ. So indeed, Dr. Kraft had defined the spectrum, as Ivor said, where diagnosing diabetes and prediabetes at yet its very earliest stage. So here's the normal pattern 1. And you can see that the insulin peaks at about 1 hour. And we can superimpose the 3 patterns of hyperinsulinemia, where you can see that the insulin can peak up to 200 microunits. Now, from a clinical perspective, I'm not necessarily interested in the 3 distinct patterns of hyperinsulinemia, but only to recognize that they are insulin excess is what they represent. Now, Catherine Crofts from Auckland, New Zealand, did her PhD thesis reanalyzing Kraft's work, and she determined a simple clinical method. That is to measure the 2-hour insulin. And if your 2-hour insulin is less than 20, or 30 rather, you're normal, and if it's over 40, you indeed have a problem, and that's what we do in our office. So what was even more interesting is Dr. Kraft compared the insulin assay to standard methods. And by standard methods, we know that is measuring blood glucose. And they include the fasting blood glucose, the 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test, which is actually a good test, and we think that more GPs and primary care doctors should be thinking about doing that, and then also hemoglobin A1C. And so what Dr. Kraft determined, when you compare to the insulin assay, glucose measurement isn't really so good. And in fact, hyperglycemia, or an elevated blood glucose, is a late finding. And you might actually have a problem for years or decades. And you're not necessarily doing this right test, which is the insulin assay. So we can detail that further. So it turns out that hyperglycemia, or high blood glucose, when done properly can pick up actually half of the individuals. Not so bad. We credit the oral glucose challenge for the 50%. If you just do a fasting glucose, it's about a quarter of the people. So again, it's an argument to do more oral glucose tolerance test. Now, what about the individuals that are euglycemic or have a normal glucose response? Well, it's not so good. Euglycemia misses 3/4 of the people who actually fail the Kraft insulin assay. So that's not reassuring at all. And any way you look at this, the glucose measurement, again, isn't so good. And even worse, you could be an individual where you have a normal glucose, and you might actually have a problem for years, it's getting worse, and you're utterly unaware and you're clueless. So you have to do the right measure, or else you don't know that there's a problem. So let's get back to the heart of the matter. And it's well established in the literature that there's a strong link between diabetes and heart disease. But when it comes to clinical medicine, that relationship becomes rather muddied. And in 2017, we still see this. On the one side, we have diabetics that don't know that they have heart disease. And on the other side, we have heart patients that don't know that they're diabetic. And even worse, their clinicians are clueless. So we ask, why is there this disconnect? Well, welcome to the Framingham distraction. So that's Framingham, Massachusetts, where back in the 1940s, they looked at the population to see which ones had heart attacks and which ones didn't. And then they tracked other things which seemed to be negatively associated, and they called them risk factors. And we know them today, such as bad cholesterol, smoking, high blood pressure, diabetes. And since the original Framingham work, they've come up with different guidelines, tools, and risk calculators, all with that central theme, to lower cholesterol. And therein lies the problem. It doesn't address metabolic disease, it doesn't address hormonal dysregulation, and it's not properly measuring for diabetes. This approach misses the mark. So here's your Framingham risk score. You ask a couple of these questions, and you take a guess whether you're going to live or whether you're going to die. And it's really a statistical guess based on epidemiology. And it's very difficult to apply any of this to the individual. Again, I said it's heavily cholesterol weighted. Now, some argue, well, it is measuring metabolic disease because diabetes risk is listed. Well, again, diabetes risk is buried the way the calculators work. It's not properly measuring glucose on these guidelines, and it doesn't even measure insulin at all. That's why Ivor and I call these the muddy waters of Framingham. So what's so important about lowering this cholesterol anyway? Medical doctrine tells us that cholesterol is bad and requires remedy, as if they're saying it's innately toxic or a poisonous substance. What? Okay, so the mechanisms. What are the mechanisms? Well, for years they've talked about some concentration gradient between cholesterol in the blood and the blood vessel wall. In recent years they talk about inflammation. Okay, but overall the mechanisms remain elusive. Well, what about the experiments? Well, there's the diet heart hypothesis that's been telling us for 50 years to lower saturated fat in the diet. but we've basically disproven that it provides any benefit in terms of reducing cardiovascular risk. What about medication? Well, you can take patients who are free of heart disease and give them a statin, but the benefit is very, very little. Now, it's important to understand in secondary prevention, and Asim had mentioned this, that there is a small mortality benefit. So that's something to consider, but overall, we're not impressed. We can further debunk the lipid hypothesis by looking at other associational studies which can definitely challenge the existing hypothesis. So the Get With the Guidelines is a really important study. In 2009, they looked at almost 140,000 patients who were hospitalized with cardiovascular events, and then they measured their cholesterol. And what they found was that 3/4 of them were actually at cholesterol goal. So the question is, if they were at goal, what were they doing in the hospital having a heart attack? In 2015, they looked at large populations of elderly people, and what they noted is that the ones with the higher cholesterol live longer. Okay, go figure. Well, guess what? Old Framingham said the same thing back in the 1960s, but of course that information got buried because it challenged the lipid hypothesis. Of course it did. So let's compare all that for the mechanisms for metabolic disease and hormonal dysregulation. And I don't have time to go into detail, but overall, Ivor and I think of this as metabolic mayhem. And downstream, it leads to things such as inflammation, oxidative stress, and advanced glycation that is ultimately damaging to the blood vessel wall. And as a result, we see atherosclerosis. Now understand that atherosclerosis is really the body's attempt trying to repair the damage. This reminds me of the plumber, by the way. So your pipes are leaking. What do? You call the plumber. He comes to your house. He wraps some tape around the problem. And most importantly, you give him some money. Now, I'm not referring to the cardiologist putting stents in, am I? Forbid. But what didn't the plumber do? He didn't check the water pressure. He didn't check the minerals in the water. He didn't address the root causes. And so you see, it's the same with atherosclerosis. Now, what about that bad cholesterol? Well, maybe it's not that it's innately toxic, but rather it's there as a consequence of all this other stuff. And the mechanisms really support it. So what studies are there to support these mechanisms for metabolic disease? Well, let's have a look. Well, here's the 2015 Eurospire, where they compared patients that had heart disease to their diabetes status. And this was a large study of, again, the European patients. And from the get-go, without measuring anything, a little more than a quarter walked through the door with a diagnosis of diabetes. Okay, great. But what Eurospire did, they looked at the ones that were supposedly normal, non-diabetic. Well, certainly they're non-diabetic. Their healthcare practitioners would have measured, right? They would have measured properly. Well, guess again. So here they took those 4,000 patients and they did the proper measures for glucose. They did a fasting blood sugar, a hemoglobin A1C, and the 2-hour glucose challenge. Now the glucose challenge, they determined where they're just measuring glucose was actually the best test out of them all. And what did they find? A third were diabetic. Oh my. Another third were at risk for diabetes. That really means they're diabetic. Now, what about the remaining third? Well, they didn't do insulin, but Ivor and I guess, and even Dr. Kraft, that if they had measured insulin, they would be diabetic as well. You put the whole group together, the whole cohort together, there you have it. All the heart patients have a problem. They're diabetic or they have an insulin problem. What did Dr. Kraft say? Those with cardiovascular disease not identified with diabetes are simply undiagnosed. Thank you, Dr. Kraft. Now, what if we do a test where we actually do measure insulin? And here we have the Helsinki policeman's trial. Now, this is actually patients who start out free of heart disease. And they measured a 2-hour insulin at the onset. And we have the low insulin group, and there's their risk of having a CHD event. And here's the high insulin group. Their risk is almost 9 or 10 times. That's a huge difference. Now let's compare that to what generally happens to cholesterol. So here's the low cholesterol group. and we track them out over the years. And then we have the high insulin group, or the high cholesterol group, I apologize. So the risk isn't even doubling, it's actually very small. And Ivor had mentioned how insignificant sometimes these studies are, where you have to get at least a 2x. Well, that's not even a 2x, okay? So there's a huge difference when you look at insulin. There's not a huge difference when you look at the cholesterol. And that's like the elephant representing really weird characters, but representing insulin. So insulin's going to better predict risk all the time. Bottom line, it's the insulin, stupid. I'm talking about my dear doctor colleagues, maybe not the ones in the room here. What is most important is to recognize that diabetes is a vascular disease. So you go after the diabetes. You focus on metabolic disease, hormonal dysregulation, and insulin. And again, many are at risk, and if you don't do the proper testing, you're not going to know that there's a problem. Now, it's not a medication approach. It's a lifestyle approach, and that's what we need to share with our doctor practitioner friends. So what are the diet and lifestyle recommendations to prevent those arteries from getting clogged? So you follow the biology and you address metabolic disease. Now, Malcolm Kendrick yesterday gave a very interesting talk, if you were there. But what Ivor and I like to focus on is more of the fundamental things that will give the benefit to the greatest amount of people, that clinicians can understand. But Malcolm's a brilliant man. So Ivor refers to this as the switches, but it's the same. So if you want to address metabolic disease, low carb is best. You reduce insulin by reducing sugar, grain, starch. You want to reduce processed food. The industrial vegetable oils, because of their molecular structure, are particularly atherogenic. If you're doing everything right, it's going to control appetite. So you're going to eat less. You're going to skip meals. It's perfect. Movement and activity, smoking cessation, sunlight, proper sleep, and happiness. Clinical assessment. So the GPs, the doctors in this room, have an early level of suspicion. And you know what? If you're really good, you can probably get away without the glucose tolerance test and measuring insulin. But as a screening tool, I think it's important for the general healthcare population, the practitioners, to do this type of testing. More doctors should do the 2-hour glucose tolerance test. And it's not an issue in the NHS. That's a test that they will allow. We can increase the sensitivity by actually measuring the 1-hour glucose as well. Then, of course, you can add on the insulin and the fasting insulin and the 2-hour insulin. Now, that's a tough one for the NHS, I understand. You measure inflammatory markers, and Ivor talked a little bit about that. We still measure lipids, but we're looking at the quality, not the quantity. And then you can do some body measurements as well. So we're going to end with the calcium score. And all the other tests are really just, in a sense, proxies to this. This is the test that sees the disease itself. And then again, David Bobbitt is our sponsor, and he produced this wonderful movie, the Widowmaker movie. You can purchase it for about $1 on Vimeo, so I'd encourage you to watch that. But here's the calcium score, where you can actually see the disease process itself, and we have 2 different individuals. And so the one on the right, we can see has a high calcium score. That is the left anterior descending artery, or the Widowmaker artery, that's lit up in white. It's filled with calcium. And so you can compare that to the individual on the left. And so that individual, the left anterior descending artery, has no calcium at all. And that is consistent throughout the study. Now, it's a little bit of radiation, but what's important there is that is a 0 score, and also that person is me. And so I have a 15-year warranty that I won't drop dead right now of a heart event or into the future, and so let's hope it stays that way. Now, I can tell you that I've now had my 2nd score this year, and it remains a 0. So that's awesome, and perhaps it's everything that I've done right now for over 17 years, and I'll continue to do so. So calcium is not a risk factor. Calcium is a disease marker, and that's the difference. It's huge. Calcium sees the disease process itself. So based on calcium score, you can determine your 10-year risk based on a 0 to 1,000 score, where your risk could go up 37 times. That's engineering precision. It's reproducible, it's quantifiable, and it's based on hundreds of thousands of subjects. And guess what? It has very little to do with cholesterol. In fact, let's look at that real quick. So here we're going to compare the calcium score to old Framingham. So Framingham uses cholesterol. And we look at the middle risk people, which is where everyone tends to fall. And old Framingham would say they get a 10% risk of having an event over 10 years. And they generally get medication. Well, what's the calcium score say? Are they all at 10%? Well, nope. We have the ones that are happy with the low risk, we have true middle risk, and we have very high risk. Okay, so Muddy Framingham takes a guess. The calcium scan sees the disease process itself. And the important point, if you have a surrogate that doesn't correlate with calcium, you probably shouldn't focus on the surrogate. And the other point is we really should do calcium scores in medical research as well, because it's an excellent marker of disease. So what if you're not so lucky as me and you have a high score from the beginning? Well, this is where calcium progression is important to halt, to stabilize your calcium. And so here's a group that have a high calcium score from the start, up to 1,000. But unfortunately, their calcium progresses. They have a 50-50 chance of having a major event. But what if we look at the individuals that actually start with a high score and they stabilize their calcium? Well, they actually collapse it down to a rate that's almost equivalent to having a low calcium score. And how are we going to address stabilizing it? Metabolic disease. Now, you can do the test every 2 to 3 years. Calcium score is in the 2013 guidelines, but sadly, most doctors don't know about it, and they don't know what to do with it. So we find it a very important test to really motivate individuals to make positive change. And also, it's obligatory for all presidents and astronauts. And they're important people, right? So they get it. Why can't we get it as well? Now, in the US, it's available for about $99. We just send them across the street. Now, here in the UK, you'll probably have to go to your private hospital to get the test done. But if there's a question, we think, again, it's very, very important. So I'm going to finish with a little US healthcare politics. Why not? But as you see, it's really the same worldwide. So we have the various administrations, and they're sitting there arguing about how they're going to pay for this expensive healthcare system and who's going to have access to it. People are getting sicker and sicker, and the cost of healthcare is on the rise. And again, the problem lies at the core. And Dr. Kalish mentioned that at the beginning of this conference, that it's a system built on sick care. We're putting out fires instead of preventing them. Now, when it comes to cardiovascular disease, don't take my word for it that there's a problem. The American Heart Association this year has said that the prevalence of heart disease is on a rise at a rate much greater than they anticipated. And in fact, by 2035, they're estimating that almost half of the American population will have some kind of heart disease. And yet they don't know what to do with it. Well, how about we address metabolic disease and take off those cholesterol goggles, right? So bringing about change is hard, and I really like to embrace and recruit. But imagine we have to get doctors involved, the pharmaceutical industry involved, the food industry involved, and also governments. And thanks to groups like PHC from SAM and Nina Teicholz's groups in the US, we have a chance to bring about change. But until we bring about that change, the question remains, can we make America healthy again? And the rest of the world. Thank you.